can honestly say that so far in my life, I have never really been chased by a monster. I have never been pursued by a knife-wielding maniac, nor hunted across uneven terrain by a slobbering, multi-headed alien eager to suck the very marrow from my bones. Up to this point, these scenarios are things that I have been able to avoid. If, however, I had been forced to sprint for my life, staring ever forward, too scared to look back as the world passed by in a streaking blur of panic and terror, pursued by something recently risen from the darkest pits of hell, I remain, even now, fairly confident that I would be able to stay on my feet, that somehow, despite the impending peril and threat to life and limb, I would manage to keep said imperiled limbs upright and headed roughly in the right direction. Somehow, despite what every horror movie would have us believe is an impossibility, I would manage to maintain my equilibrium and dodge those pockets of localized gravity that seem to fling every horror heroine and every final girl, sprawling to the floor whenever they are being chased. I watched and I sighed. Though it is imperative, more imperative than it has ever been, that these endangered damsels make a quick and unencumbered getaway, every star pursued in these movies will somehow find a way to fling themselves to the ground, to become implausibly tangled up in the treacherously constrictive movements of their own 2 feet, and will tumble, spread-eagled to the ground before the path of the thing that is hunting them. I watched and I despaired, as those in the movie theatre around me screamed and bawled, imploring the heroine to run, for God's sake, run. I found myself unable to echo their sentiments without adding to the command. Run properly! I would scream in impotent frustration to no effect at all. After a while, it began to annoy me more than it should. Seeing them do it every single time, I found myself wishing that some deviant director would be tempted to string up a contraption that would electrify the ground, or perhaps splash small patches of the impromptu landing pad with some highly corrosive acid, so that the frequent faller's skin might bubble and boil from off the bone, teaching all others to perform the action properly. I watched and I seethed. I know, of course, that this is a cliché inserted to serve a purpose, a trope that has a function. By falling down, the hero or heroine raises the tension, increasing the likelihood that they might be caught and driving the audience to the edge of their seats with not a fingernail left to bite. The falls are a useful tool, or at least they would be if they were not so overused as to be predictable and boring, so well-trodden and achingly threadbare that the sense of peril is suddenly encumbered not by some stray object laid in our path, but by the sheer laughable predictability of the tumble. I watched and I yawned, but I also began to think, are those ridiculous falls you see in the movies actually more accurate than you might think? How often, when experiencing real terror or danger, do people really become that unsteady? That likely to trip and fall multiple infuriating times? I watched and I wondered. I searched for videos of people being chased by animals, packs of dogs, for example, or bulls in those strange Spanish festivals where men demonstrate their bravery by running alongside the beasts. I watched footage of soldiers or riot mobs descending upon innocent civilians and unsuspecting passers-by. News reports of terrorist attacks and natural disasters, looking to see, how often did the threatened fall? The footage was inconclusive. Whilst I most often saw people running quite well when the panic hit them, there were a few. Others, who somehow, in spite of their own natural instinct for survival, seemed completely incapable of remaining upright when it counted. These limp-legged few were inexplicably set on stumbling. In those real-life examples, which I counted carefully, around 40% of the videos featured people who, when fleeing, crumbled, implausibly, at the knees, collapsing as if their legs had turned to rubber bands. Which, of course, was useful information. I watched and was intrigued. Could you tell, I wondered, who would be a runner and who a faller? Could you see, just in the composition of a person, their attitude, personality and manner, whether they would sprint away to freedom or splinter into 1,000 falling shards? I believe that you could. I believed, and I planned. It isn't easy to scare someone so badly that their legs stop working. It's even harder to actually scare someone to death, to make someone so panicked, so utterly distraught with terror and fear that their mind is unable to cope and their body responds by going into cardiac arrest. That is a tricky challenge, but a neat trick nonetheless. You see, a cardiac event shows no external wound, no ugly scar or laceration, no blunt trauma caused by a heavy object. A cardiac arrest, even one caused by terror, is a reaction that comes from within the body, something that the body in essence does to itself. Whilst that reaction might have been in response to some outside stimulus, the person providing that stimulus could hardly be blamed for the poor victim's condition, at least not in a court of law. No man, as much as he might wish to, could reach inside the chest of another and squeeze the rubbery pulp of his heart until it burst between his fingers. A heart attack is unfortunate, but it isn't murder, or at least not a murder you could prove. I tell you these things not by way of a confession, but more as a passing comment, a thought experiment, if you will. Consider then, purely hypothetically of course, that you wished to have your adversary done away with, removed as a player from the stage of life, without ever having to endure the attached consequences of trial and imprisonment. In such a scenario as that, the ability to scare someone to death, to force them into cardiac arrest without ever actually having to lay a finger upon them, would be rather useful, would it not? I watched and I waited. Consider also what power, what enormous unadulterated power you might have over another, if on several prior occasions that other man had allowed himself to be put under your hypnotic influence. Now obviously, as a hypnotist myself, you will naturally think I am speaking autobiographically, but remember this is hypothetical, not hypnothetical. It is a story made of little more than words and imagination, like most people's lives. But come, let us use that imagination to create a scenario, a scene during which an intelligent, loyal and loving husband becomes a cuckold and finds himself somehow usurped by a man over whom he holds just such a terrible power of influence, who in such a situation could honestly say that they would not fold to temptation, falling morally as easily as those damsels who trip and tumble in the movies, who, I ask you, faced with the opportunity to exert that same power of suggestion with the additional help of chemical hypnotics and hallucinogens slipped into their rival's drink, could resist the temptation to play with the mind of their enemy, to take it in their hands and mold it like putty to any shape they so desired, to show them things so wicked, so evil and dark that they mirror the rotten soul they keep inside. Who would not show them, coming in hot pursuit, the things that they most feared? Who would not love to scream in panic, putting on pretense as they point to some imagined horror chasing quickly behind them, describing in graphic detail the hideous beast that pursues them, so that their nemesis might also begin to imagine and then actually see the thing you have conjured from nothing, bounding and leaping with gnashing jaws toward them, terrors made of little more than words and imagination? Who in that situation, watching their enemy screech and cry in a blind panic at the vision he sees before him, would not run alongside pretending to see the very same? Who would not throw themselves recklessly down as if tripping to the floor in the act of escape, knowing all the while that their companion is seeing that thing with its bulbous eyes and glistening fangs, getting closer, its waiting jaws nearer and nearer? Who would not smile at seeing that other man, that home-wrecking deceiver, mirror their actions by crashing heavily forward and delight in having judged him correctly as one who would always, predictably fall? Judged him as one whose lack of internal fortitude would leave him structurally vulnerable, always prone to just such an implosion and collapse, the type who was always bound and destined to fall, and who, upon seeing him there, prone on all fours, splayed upon the ground and cursed by his own clumsy ineptitude, could resist getting close to his ear, close enough to whisper with hideous sibilant relish the words, "The floor is lava," who would not watch with exquisite pleasure as their wretched companion frantically rolled and twisted, writhing and screaming as if burning to death, blistering and melting into an agony made within their own mind? Who would not feel the greatest satisfaction when in the end they clutched at their chest and succumbed right there on the carpet, leaving behind them not a single trace of the hand that dealt the blow? Who, I ask, after witnessing such a thing, could see those falling maidens in the movies and not find in their pantomime flailing some bitter form of amusement? I watch and I laugh to see how the mighty have fallen,